You may be seated. Good morning. Let the record reflect that the defendant is present, along with counsel for the defendant, assistant state attorneys, both sides ready to proceed.
Yes, sir.
Okay, who will be the state's first witness?
Stephen Shaw.
Okay, let's bring the jury in. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Did you heed all of my previous admonition during your semi-weekend break? Okay. Does the state recognize the presence of the jury?
Sure.
And does the defense?
Yes, sir, we do.
State may call the next witness.
State would call Stephen Shaw.
You solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
I'm Stephen Shaw, S-T-E-P-H-E-N-S-H-A-W.
And Mr. Shaw, how are you employed?
I'm a hair and fiber examiner for the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory.
And how long have you been employed in that capacity?
I've held my current position for approximately 6 years.
What educational background do you have that led you to your present position?
I have a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Science. Both degrees are in textile chemistry, and both degrees are from North Carolina State University.
After obtaining your degrees, did you immediately go to work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
No, after getting my degrees, I was a research associate for the university for approximately 6 months. Then I took another job in the textile industry where I was a senior research associate for approximately 6 months, and then I began work at the FBI laboratory.
During your time with the FBI, did you have additional education through the FBI itself?
Yes, I did.
What type of training was that?
I received, to become a hair and fiber examiner, I received approximately a 1-year training program where I was under the direct guidance of qualified hair and fiber examiners. And during that time, I examined numerous hairs and numerous fibers, and I had to complete tests throughout my training program, including identification tests, matching tests, oral boards, as well as moot court exercises.
And how long, and after that year period of time, did you then become working independently as a hair and fiber examiner?
After completing that year of time, I began working independently as a hair and fiber examiner.
And have you previously testified as an expert in that area in courts of law in the United States?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
12 times.
And in how many different jurisdictions?
I've testified prior in Florida, in New York, Virgin Islands, California, Montana, Illinois, Virginia, are a few.
All right. This time, Your Honor, I would submit the witness as an expert in the area of forensic hair and fiber identification and analysis.
What says the defense?
No objections.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the witness will be accepted as an expert witness in the area of hair and fiber identification. You may continue, Mr. Ashton.
Sir, back in the middle part of 2008, you were working at the FBI lab at that point. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you become involved in doing a confirmation examination of a hair in the case involving Kaylee Marie Anthony, which was designated as Q12, that Karen Korsberg-Lowe had previously examined?
Yes.
Right. What's the purpose of that process of confirmation, as I think you call it?
Yeah, the confirmation process is really a quality assurance step to make sure anytime we have...
Apologize, Mr. So at this time, we would object and renew our previous motions and objections under Fry.
Based upon that objection would be overruled. You may continue. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So it's a part of our quality assurance procedure. So whenever we have an identification or we associate an association, we then have a second examiner to do an independent examination to see if they can reach the same conclusion or not.
Now, when you do that, do you already know the conclusions that the other examiner has found?
Yes, we do.
So in this case, were you looking to confirm the identification of apparent decomposition? Is that just that, or the comparison to the purported known hair as well?
It was a confirmation for the apparent decomposition as well as microscopic similarities to a hair collected from a hairbrush.
And did you confirm both the apparent decomposition and the microscopic similarity to the hair from the hairbrush?
Yes, I did.
Did there come a time later in 2008 when you were called upon to examine some additional evidence as to the same case?
Yes.
What came into the laboratory? First of all, why did you do the second examination as opposed to Ms. Lowe?
Because Ms. Lowe wasn't available at the time.
Now, what came into your laboratory? Were you submitted what is referred to as a hair mass?
Yes, I was.
If I could have States Exhibit 271, Madam Clerk. Let me show you States Exhibit 271 and ask if you recognize that as the item that we just referred to that was submitted to your laboratory.
I do recognize it.
And should that contain the hair mask that was submitted by Orange County Sheriff's Office or the Medical Examiner's Office?
Yes, according to the laboratory markings, it should.
Now, what type of examination did you perform on, and you designated this Q59 for your purposes, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So what type of examination did you do on States Exhibit 271, your Q59?
I examined the hairs from the hair mass microscopically, and I also then compared those hairs to the hair previously reported as originating from the trunk of the vehicle.
Now, when you examined the hair mass, did you find evidence of apparent decomposition on the hair mass?
Yes.
Did you find a band similar to what you had seen on the Q12 hair in the hair mass?
There was a band just above the end of the root. It was not similar, I would say, to the hair in the trunk, the band itself. It was a band just above the root, and the root itself had sort of a brush-like appearance. So it's really a later stage of apparent decomposition than what was seen in the trunk.
So the hair in the trunk, did it still have, it had the band and still had the root? Do I understand that correctly?
It had, the hair in the trunk, yes, still had a band with root material below the band.
And the hairs in the Q59 had the band, but the root had a brush-like appearance.
That's correct.
And is that brush-like appearance associated with later stages of decomposition?
Yes.
Now, did you also compare the hairs in Q59, in essence, as a purported known sample of the victim's hair to the hair from Q59 to determine whether they were microscopically similar?
Yes, I did.
And what was the conclusion of that comparison?
The previously reported Q12 hair, Caucasian head hair exhibiting characteristics of apparent decomposition at the root end exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as the Caucasian head hairs from the hair mass. Accordingly, this hair and the hair mass are consistent with originating from the same source. However, it should be noted that hairs are not a means of positive identification. In other words, I cannot say that a hair did originate from a person to the exclusion of all others. I can say it is consistent. It should also be noted that the hair mass itself is not a suitable known hair sample. In other words, I did not have hairs plucked from an individual scalp, from a known individual scalp.
And the reason you add that caveat is because obviously you as an examiner cannot testify that the hair mass came from the victim, just that all you know is it was found with the victim. Is that the correct assessment of your caveat?
We don't know, I don't know, the source of those hairs.
All right. Now, have you, in your work at the FBI, participated in a research project to further the scientific knowledge in the area of this decomposition artifact that we've been talking about?
I have, yes.
What type of research project have you been involved in?
I've been conducting a study that is still ongoing. I've just started writing the manuscript. I'm in that phase right now. So the preliminary results are 600 hairs stored in various locations. And these 600 hairs were collected from 15 living individuals, so 600 ante-mortem hairs. And the hairs, again, were stored in various conditions to include indoors on a windowsill, indoors buried in potting soil that was watered and fertilized weekly, indoors submerged in water, outdoors in a grassy area that received direct sunlight, outdoors in a wooded area that did not receive direct sunlight, and in 3 different vehicles. In the trunk of a vehicle that was used during the time periods, underneath the seat of a second vehicle that was also used during the time periods, and on the dash and in the trunk of a third vehicle that was not used during the time periods. And this vehicle was parked in a location where it could receive direct sunlight. The time periods varied anywhere from approximately a week to approximately 7 months. At the end of those time periods, I then examined hairs at the root end microscopically to determine changes, if there are microscopic changes at the root end. No hairs stored in the vehicles and no hairs indoors on the windowsill exhibited characteristics of apparent decomposition. Some of the hairs stored outdoors, most of the hairs buried in potting soil, and most of the hairs submerged in water did exhibit characteristics of apparent decomposition. And some of these characteristics are similar to characteristics we see in hairs removed post-mortem. However, no post-mortem banding was observed in any of these hairs. Okay, so they did exhibit some apparent decomposition, but no banding. I then set up a test where I included all hairs that had any possible changes at the root end in the test. I also included hairs known to be removed from deceased individuals, so known post-mortem hairs. Those also were included in this test. The test was given to 2 different examiners, not involved in the initial analysis, but 2 different examiners. And they were given 3 answer sheets total. They were each given an answer sheet to do their initial analysis, and they were asked to identify any hairs given to them that exhibited characteristics of apparent decomposition with post-mortem banding. Besides their initial analysis answer sheet, they were also given a confirmed results answer sheet where they discussed their initial analysis to come up with one confirmed result. In the confirmed results, the hairs correctly identified all of the post-mortem banded hairs and excluded all of the environmental hairs in this study as being banded. In their initial analysis, Examiner 1 correctly identified all of the post-mortem hairs that were banded, but it also included one of the antemortem hairs, so one of the environmentally studied hairs in this study, as banded. Examiner 2 correctly, in his initial analysis, identified all of the post-mortem banded hairs, but also identified one of the hairs, one of the antemortem hairs, as banded. So each examiner initially made an error in determining banding. With their confirmed results, they excluded those two environmentally stored hairs and only had the post-mortem banded hairs as their confirmed result.
Let me clarify one thing on that. Did each of the two, and again, was this test a blind test?
It was blind in that they didn't know the answers. They didn't know if any post-mortem hairs were actually put in to the test. They were aware that I had been doing a study on the environmental impact of hairs from living individuals, but that's all they knew.
All right. And just to clarify, one examiner in his initial examination picked out one hair as possible banding, and the other examiner in his initial examination picked out a different hair as possible banding. And then when the two got together, they agreed that both should be excluded as postmortem banding. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation to demonstrate the results of your study?
Yes, I did.
All right. Let me show you State's Exhibit QL for identification and ask you, is that the PowerPoint to demonstrate the study?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, for demonstrative purposes, I'd like to publish to the jury State's QL. I'm not moving into evidence since it does not involve the evidence in this case.
Your Honor, may we approach? It's a disqualification.
You may continue, Mr. Ashton.
Mr. Shaw, we were discussing the study that you have performed. Let me go back and ask you, what caused you to become interested in doing a study like this? What was the inspiration for that?
It really was started because of a thesis that I came across at John Jay College, where they had taken hairs from living individuals and placed them in soil and in water, and had gotten decomposition in those hairs at the root end, or apparent decomposition. And it was suggested in that study that these hairs, additional research is needed, and that these hairs be compared, or hairs like them compared to post-mortem hairs. And so that's what I did.
So the thesis study found some sort of artifact in hairs from live people in those environmental conditions, but suggested that further study needed to be done comparing them to actual post-mortem hairs.
That's correct.
Now, did this particular case, your involvement in this particular case, have any, give you any additional interest in doing this study?
I think I probably would have done this study anyway, just not when I did. I think it was more of a priority because of this case.
Because of the issues in this case?
Correct.
Now, was the purpose, if you can put it in one line for us, what was the purpose of the study? What were you trying to figure out?
I was trying to recreate banding in hairs from living individuals.
Now, do hairs even that are not connected to living individuals still decompose in some respect?
Yes, they can if they're exposed.
Was the purpose to determine whether this particular artifact of decomposition could come from a live person's hair? Was that what you were looking for?
That's correct.
And again, how did you get the hairs for the study?
I went through an approval process to collect the hair samples, and then I asked for volunteers to volunteer their hair samples.
And
Request that this testimony be limited. Lack of disclosure. We don't have a copy of what he's testifying about.
Objection overruled.
Again, how many individuals did you take hair samples from?
I took hair samples from, I received hair samples from 18 individuals. I used 15 in this study.
And were these hairs that were actually pulled from the volunteer individuals?
Yes, correct.
What were the gender distribution of these individuals?
Males and females.
And what were the age ranges of the individuals?
The youngest was 3. The oldest was, I believe, 53. I may have to check. It's 52 or 53.
In their 50s?
Yes.
Okay. And what variety of environmental conditions did you expose these hairs to in order to do this study?
Indoors on a windowsill, indoors buried in potting soil with plants that were watered and fertilized, indoors submerged in water, outdoors in an area exposed to sunlight, outdoors in a wooded area not exposed to sunlight, and in 3 different vehicles. In the trunk of a vehicle that was used during the time period, underneath the seat of a second vehicle that was also used during the time period, and on the dash in the trunk of a third vehicle that was not used during the time period and was parked, remained stationary throughout the time periods and was parked in direct sunlight.
When you say used during the time period, you mean someone's vehicle that was actually used on a daily basis?
Correct. I mean, someone continued about their normal use with the hairs in their location.
And how did you, place the hairs or isolate them so that they would be undisturbed for the study, like in the cars, for instance?
I used tape to fold over the distal ends, the tip ends of the hairs, leaving the proximal or root end of the hairs exposed. And then I gave these hairs to individuals to place in the vehicles, and told them, not to clean their vehicle or anything, but just place these hairs as they are, as their vehicle is, or whatever the conditions, however they exist.
All right. And did you check the hairs at intervals as to each environmental condition, or just at the end?
I would check sort of an earlier time period, so around 1 to 4 weeks, and then I would check at a longer time period. So the ones collected at a shorter time period were collected and examined. There were additional hairs that were not disturbed, and those were placed between 3 months and approximately 7 months.
Is the difference between what you refer to as a postmortem banding and other types of decomposition a subtle difference?
Overruled.
In my opinion, it's an obvious difference.
And in your study, when you examined all of these hairs from all of these different environmental conditions from live people, did you find any that, in your opinion, would qualify as postmortem banding?
No, I did not.
Now, you discussed a blind study that you did of some of these hairs and the outcome of that. Tell us about that.
Yes, I included all the hairs with any possible change at the root end into this test, as well as hairs known to be removed from deceased individuals. They were also included in the same test. And the test was given to 2 different examiners who were asked to identify any hairs exhibiting characteristics of apparent decomposition with postmortem banding. They were given 3 answer sheets total, an answer sheet each for their initial analysis, and then a confirmed results answer sheet where they discussed their initial analysis to come up with one confirmed result. In Examiner 1's initial analysis, he correctly identified all the postmortem banded hairs, but also identified an antemortem hair, so one of the hairs in this study, as banded.
Let me ask you a question about it before you go on. So this examiner number 1 picked out one of the hairs that was from a live person as initially indicating it might have postmortem banding. Do I have that right?
Correct.
Okay. And how about the other examiner?
The second examiner also correctly identified all the postmortem banded hairs, and also in his initial analysis identified one of the antemortem hairs in this study as banded.
But did he identify the same one that the first examiner had identified?
No, they were different hairs stored under the same conditions, but different hairs. And so in their final, when they discuss and they come up with one confirmed results, they excluded those two hairs.
Now, that coming together, that conferencing, is that something that examiners would do in a real case if they disagreed on a call?
Yes.
So that basically, did that imitate the real world environment of how examiners come to decisions?
It's similar.
So in the end, they agreed that neither was postmortem banding. Is that?
That's correct.
Now, in this study, did you find hairs with apparent decomposition?
Yes.
And is postmortem banding a sort of a specific subset of various artifacts of decomposition of a hair?
Yes, it is.
So while you found decomposition in the hairs, did you find any that had postmortem banding?
Not in the study, no.
Now, did you also bring with us today a copy of a photograph, a digital copy of a photograph of the actual Q12 hair that you examined as a confirming examiner with Ms. Lowe back in 2008?
Yes.
Right. QM.
What says the defense?
No objection.
To be received in evidence, the state's number.
301.
May I publish, Your Honor?
You may.
Mr. Shaw, you see the state's exhibit 301 that's on screen in front of you.
Yes, I do.
And is that the photograph of the particular hair, which is designated Q12 in this case?
Yes.
May I publish it?
You may publish.
Okay, now that we have the actual photograph in front of us, can you show the jury the postmortem band that you saw in this case and upon your confirming examination?
Sure. The band is in between these two lines, so that dark, opaque area above the root.
And is that a fairly classic example of postmortem banding?
Overruled.
It's what I would identify as postmortem banding. Yes, it's a band above the root, a root bulb.
And again, it's that artifact we see in this photograph. Was that seen in any of the photographs of in your study involving live persons?
No, it was not.
No further questions.
Motion to strike would be denied. Cross-examination. You may.
May it please the court,
You may proceed, Mr. Baez.
Mr. Ashton. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Mr. Shaw.
Good morning.
How are you, sir?
Very good.
I want to ask you just a few questions about, first off, the hair that you observed in this case, the Q12, the one we saw the photograph. You testified that when you got the 59, Q59, which was the hair mat from Suburban Drive, that the characteristics were not similar, correct?
What I was speaking of is the characteristics of the root portion itself. I did not do a side-by-side comparison of the root portions, but the hair from the trunk had root material below the band. The hairs in the hair mass had a dark band just above the end of the root, but it had more of a brush-like, it's what I would classify as a brush-like appearance to it.
So it was a different appearance to you,
Yes.
and that's why you testified that you would not say it's similar.
Speaking just about the root portions, that's correct. They were dissimilar.
Okay, and when you observed and you did this study, you were prompted to do it based on the thesis from John Jay College, the graduate student, correct?
That's correct.
And this study found live people to have apparent decomposition and postmortem root banding, did it not? From live people.
No, they did not make that conclusion. They refer to some of their changes as fraying, darkening, and they did refer to some of their changes as banding, but they indicated it was a band further down into the root, so closer to the end of the root than postmortem is observed.
Okay. And that would be the one you would find similar from, that description would best fit the description of the Q59 sample that you examined?
It's closer to that, but what they were seeing is decomposition in the actual root material itself. The hair mass did not have much of any root material remaining. It was mostly just a shaft, the band just above the end of the hair.
Okay. Now, the study that you have, you were, and from what you've also seen in your experience, you've seen darkening near the root, or actually on the root, correct? From live people?
In this study, down into the root bulb, yes.
Okay. And you've also seen it further up the hair, correct?
We've seen striations further up the hair.
Okay. And I know in your testimony you claim that the difference is obvious between what you call apparent decomposition and postmortem root banding, right?
Correct. Well, I'm sorry. Apparent decomposition is an umbrella of different types of decomposition that we see. As far as apparent decomposition from removed from individuals after they have deceased, postmortem banding is one of the types of apparent decomposition that we see.
It's a broader term.
Apparent decomposition is a broader term. Yes,
Okay.
correct.
And that's what Ms. Lowe indicated in her report, that there was apparent decomposition, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you had mentioned that the differences, of course, are obvious to you.
Yes.
Okay. But they weren't quite obvious to the examiners that assisted you in the study, correct?
Correct. In their initial analysis, they did identify one of the antemortem hairs each as banded.
So what we're really talking about, when you look at some darkening, and let's take this step by step. You get a hair, you inspect it under a microscope, correct?
Correct. I examine it using a microscope.
And you make a call. You make a decision. You give your opinion.
Correct. We examine the hair and the characteristics that are present, and based on our training and our experience, we reach conclusions.
Okay. And when these two different examiners on two different hairs gave their opinion, they were wrong.
Correct. They did commit errors.
Okay. And when we say they were wrong, we're really just saying that they said what was banding is different than what you say is banding, correct?
No, that's incorrect. They realized between themselves that they made errors in their initial analysis and were able to exclude with the confirmed results, we're able to exclude those two hairs.
Let me see if I can redo the question, because I'm not certain I asked you this correctly.
Sustain, rephrase your question.
Let me rephrase this, sir.
Sure.
You don't know if postmortem root banding is exclusively from people who are deceased, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you can never testify in a court of law to such a fact.
That's correct.
Okay. So when someone says this is postmortem root banding, they're not saying it's from a dead person, correct?
That's correct. Not
Okay.
exclusively.
So that's what I meant when I said the person who made the call, they were wrong according to what you consider postmortem root banding.
Well, not just what I consider postmortem root banding, but also the two of them. I mean, once they did initial analysis and discussions, they excluded those hairs.
Okay, let me take this step by step. There's examiner A and examiner B,
Correct.
And these are people who are just as qualified as you are.
Yes, that's correct.
They have the same training you go through,
That's correct.
and they have the same amount of experience as you do.
No,
More?
less.
Less? Okay. And why did you choose someone for your study with less experience?
They were two examiners that were not involved in my initial analysis of these hairs.
Okay.
So
and they have observed the same characteristics in other hairs.
I'm sorry, can you clarify that?
They have, examiner A and examiner B have both seen apparent decomposition in hairs. Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And they've also seen what is called postmortem root banding in hairs.
Yes.
So when examiner A inspected a hair and found postmortem root banding, his opinion from that inspection is different from what you would say is postmortem root banding.
In that initial analysis, that's correct.
Okay. And when examiner B did the examination and found postmortem root banding, his opinion is different than what your opinion would be.
Correct. In that initial analysis, that's correct.
Okay. Now, this is still a very ongoing area of forensic science, is it not?
There's still research being done. I mean, I'm conducting research myself. It's pretty well established discipline, but it's mostly, for the most part, based on the experience of hair examiners and observing hairs known to be from deceased individuals, hairs known to be from living individuals, and noticing these differences.
Now, you've never testified in a court of law about postmortem root banding, have you, sir?
I have not.
Okay. And this is your very first time in the United States testifying to such a thing.
That's correct.
And when you, after you submitted a deposition in this case, correct?
I did.
I was present,
Yes.
and Mr. Ashton was present,
Yes.
and this occurred in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Okay, and subsequent to us taking your deposition, you submitted for an approval of a validation study of postmortem root banding, did you not?
That's correct.
And in that submission, you requested approval for this project to be expedited.
Yes, that's right.
And that is in order for it to be complete before trial.
Yes, correct.
And this was subsequent to you giving your opinion in this case.
It was after the deposition.
And after also reports that you've submitted in this case.
Yes, that's correct.
So to sum it up, you wrote your report, correct? Is that a
Correct.
yes?
Correct.
You have to say yes for the court report.
Sure.
And you testified under oath,
Correct.
and then you did a validation study for postmortem root banding.
That's correct. The postmortem root banding was already what I would consider valid. It was based primarily on experience. Not a lot of research studies have gone into studying the effects of environmental hairs on antemortem. So that's why I did look into that, especially after coming across the thesis from John Jay College.
And a huge part of that, what's established, is that you cannot say postmortem root banding comes from a dead person.
That's correct.
And from what you observed, even in your own study, after you gave your opinions in this case, was that subjecting hairs to different environments can alter the appearance of a hair to include darkening on the hair, correct?
You can get darkening on the hair, yes.
To the point where even a trained forensic examiner would call it postmortem root banding.
That's what occurred in their initial analysis, correct.
Now, again, what you received in this case was only one hair.
I'm sorry.
From, the Q12, and what was given to you initially was only one hair.
Correct.
And in your experience, human beings shed many hairs all the time.
Yes, they do shed. We shed on average around 100 hairs per day. Most of the hairs, though, that are shed are naturally shed hairs that have a club-like appearance to them.
And then sometimes someone brushes their hair or something happens and someone's hair will stick on some clothing, right?
Correct.
Okay. And one of the reasons you have a job is because hairs are found everywhere at scenes, correct?
Yes, correct.
In fact, it's one of the most frequent things that are left at a scene.
We see hairs at scenes all the time.
And a lot of these hairs aren't coming off of someone pulling hair or brushing their hair or anything like that. There are things called transfer, correct?
Correct.
And when we say transfer, we're referring to I have some contact with you. Somehow your hair ends up on my jacket sleeve, and I could transfer it somewhere else, correct?
Correct. That's called an indirect transfer.
Okay. And also called secondary transfer.
Yes.
Okay. Other transfer would be my own hair is on me somehow, somewhere, and I come into contact with something, and that sheds a hair.
Yes, that's correct.
Correct. And the likelihood of transfer, or saying if you only find one hair, that is consistent with transfer, is it not?
I'm sorry, can you clarify that?
If I have one hair that I leave at a crime scene, and that hair is there, doesn't necessarily mean the person was there, does it?
That's correct. I can't tell how that hair got to that location.
And the fact that you would find one hair at a scene and not a bunch of hairs, that is consistent with transfer, is it not, sir?
I'm sorry, can you clarify that?
No, I'll rephrase the question, no problem. If you find multiple hairs, numerous hairs, that's not as consistent with transfer as much as if you only find one hair, correct?
Well, finding any hairs separate from a person's scalp would be a transfer.
It would be consistent with transfer, correct?
Finding any hairs in a location other than the person's scalp would indicate a transfer occurred.
And the likelihood is even increased more so if you only find one hair, correct?
No, it's a transfer whether it's one hair or many hairs.
What I mean, sir, is rather than the actual person being at that location, that's what I'm referring to. I know that they're all considered transfer, but generally speaking, as opposed to the person actually being at that location, it is more consistent with transfer if you just find one hair. Wouldn't you agree?
So, direct transfer.
Correct.
Where it may indicate that. I mean, again, we don't know, even from a single hair, how it got to that location, whether it was directly transferred, meaning it went directly from the source to that location, or indirectly transferred, meaning it went to another intermediate object and then to that case, and then to that location.
And to conclude on your study, the environmental conditions were completely different from your study than they weren't done in Florida, were they?
No, they were not.
Where were they done, sir?
They were conducted around Quantico, Virginia.
Okay. What time of the year?
Between the months of August and April.
Get pretty cold up there during those months?
It does.
And of course, climate and heat is the biggest factor that speeds up the decomposition process, does it not?
That's my understanding.
Heat plays a major role in decomposition, does it not, sir?
My understanding is that heat can increase the rate of decomposition, but that's really not my area of expertise.
Thank you, sir.
Any redirect?
Just a couple of questions, sir. The brush-like appearance that counsel asked you about that distinguished the Q59 hairs found at the scene of the body and the Q12 hair from the trunk, is that an indicator of more advanced decomposition?
Yes, the hair mass and the brush-like appearance is an indicator of further decomposition.
The two hairs that Mr. Baez spent some time speaking to you about that initial examiners included as banding and then excluded, what were the environmental conditions under which those two hairs were maintained?
They were both submerged in water for approximately 17 days.
So neither one of those hairs was in the trunk of a car.
That's correct.
The Q12 hair that counsel was asking you about, he talked about shed hairs. Was Q12 a shed hair?
No, Q12 was an anagen or stretched root hair, which would indicate some force was required to remove that hair.
In all of, and counsel correctly pointed out that you see hairs all the time from crime scenes, correct?
Yes.
Over your career, would it be a fair statement that you've seen thousands of hairs?
That's fair, yes.
Aside from this particular case, the Q12 hair, have you ever seen a hair with the decomp band that didn't come from a corpse?
No, I have not.
No further questions.
Recrosses to those issues alone?
And that last question that Mr. Ashton asked you, this is the first time you've testified about this topic, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And are you aware of the thesis that was conducted that you based this study on, the underlying conclusion?
I've read it. I'm familiar with it.
Okay. Are you aware of the conclusion that
Objection, hearsay, non-authoritative.
You may. You may proceed, Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Shaw, just 2 quick points that I'd like to touch upon. Based on your studies and experience, it is true that environmental effects could cause confusion in identifying or misidentifying postmortem root bandings, correct?
Without proper training, there is that possibility.
Now, when you testified about the type of root on the Q12 hair, and you said that some force would have had to been used, that doesn't mean that someone pulled that hair out, correct?
Not necessarily, no.
In fact, it could have come out through a brush.
It could have.
Yes. And numerous other ways as well, correct?
Correct.
No further questions.
Yes, sir.
Would moving a dead body be one of those ways that the hair could have been pulled out?
It could, yes.
No further questions.
May the witness be excused.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. You may be excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
State may call in the next witness.
You ever call Elizabeth Fontaine?
Stand here. Raise your right hand and you start out. You solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you. To you.
My name is Elizabeth Fontaine, and my last name is spelled Fontaine.
You may proceed.
Thank you. How are you presently employed?
I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
And what is your job with the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
I'm a physical scientist forensic examiner in the Latent Print Operations Unit.
And how long have you been employed in that capacity in that unit?
For 4.5 years.
And what what is your education that led you to that job?
I have a Master's of Science degree in Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences with a concentration in Forensic Drug Chemistry from the University of Florida, located in Gainesville, Florida. I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Microbiology with a minor in Chemistry from the University of Rhode Island, located in Kingston, Rhode Island.
And have you had any training within the FBI that led you to your present position?
Yes. I successfully completed an approximate 18-month training program in the Latent Print Unit at the FBI. During that training program, I learned about the biology of friction-rich skin, how to record known prints, how to properly handle and process evidence for the detection of latent prints, and how to actually conduct comparisons. During my training, I processed hundreds of items of evidence and completed approximately 75,000 comparisons. Towards the end of my training, I worked cases under the supervision of a certified examiner, and upon completion of the training program, I successfully completed the FBI's certification exam in the area of friction ridge analysis.
And when did you become, is there a point when you become an examiner that's permitted to do examinations after your training is over?
I was certified in July of 2008. Following that period, I was on what we call a probationary period for 6 months. This is when a supervisor looks over your work for a period of time, and after that 6-month period is completed, you are able to work cases without having someone check over your work completely. However, our work still goes through a technical and administrative review process.
Now, is the period of what you call probation, is that standard for all new examiners?
Yes, it is.
So it's not like a punishment for anything?
No.
Okay. Now, I'll direct your attention to December of 2008 and ask if you had occasion to examine some evidence submitted in the investigation of the death of one Kaylee Marie Anthony.
Yes, I did.
And was that in the form of some duct tape that was reported to you as having been obtained from the remains?
Yes, it was 3 pieces of duct tape.
All right. Let me show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit for identification KN. May I approach the witness?
You may.
Let me show you State's Exhibit KN for identification and ask if you recognize it.
Yes, I do, and I know I do because my initials appear on the white tag on the outer packaging of the bag.
Right. And is this the bag that you were sent which contained the duct tape?
Yes, and again, I know this because my initials appear on one of the seals of me indicating that I sealed this package.
Thank you. This time, Your Honor, I move into evidence State's Exhibit KN for identification.
What says the defense?
The package, Your Honor.
You may. We received an evidence the state's numbered
302.
Now, Ms. Fontaine, when you got this item of evidence, did you have to go any efforts to separate the 3 pieces, or were they already separated?
May I refer to my case notes, please?
You may.
Your Honor, may I refer to my notes?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Upon initial receipt of the evidence, how I receive evidence is an item of evidence receives a Q if it is a questioned item. Other items receive K if it is a known item. In this case, those 3 pieces of duct tape were received to me as Q items, and I refer to them as Q62, Q63, and Q64. Q62, upon initial receipt, was a separate piece of tape, and Q63 and Q64 were initially received on top of each other or stuck together.
Did you have to use any efforts to separate them?
I actually did not separate those 2 pieces of tape that were stacked or stuck together. An examiner in the trace evidence unit did this.
All right. Did you, however, later examine them separately?
I examined them stuck together and separately.
Now, can you describe first Q62 as far as its size and its condition, according to, and if you need to refer to your notes, refresh your recollection, go right ahead.
My notes indicate that Q62, Q63, and Q64 were each approximately 6 to 8 inches in length.
All right. And what was their condition as far as, did you note that they are weathered or that they look new, old, any of those observations?
Okay. I have indicated in my notes that the glue was almost gone and that the duct tape was no longer sticky. And the glue had migrated along with the strings or fibers within the duct tape towards one end and had formed a glob of glue and fibers. Basically, the duct tape was no longer a sticky type tape, but rather the plastic with the glue and strings hanging on to the rest of the plastic.
So had some of the strings separated from the plastic or vinyl part of the tape.
That's correct.
Now, did you subject Q62, Q63, and Q64 to examination in an effort to find possible latent fingerprints?
Yes, I did.
Now, were you given a history of where this tape was found, under what conditions?
I was told that the tape was found on the remains and that it was found in an area that was periodically subjected to flooding.
Exception.
She is an expert, Your Honor, and she's permitted to base her opinion on hearsay, and I'm going to ask her opinion in a moment.
Overruled.
All right. Now, based upon the history you were given, did you have an expectation of any probability of finding latent fingerprints?
Objection, Judge. Call for qualification.
Overruled.
Go ahead.
Evidence that is subjected to environmental factors, I would not expect latent prints to be found. This is because latent prints are very fragile and are comprised of oil, sweat, or similar substances. However, I do not go into an examination process if I have the thought that I will not expect to see latent prints. It does not change my examination of that item of evidence. My process and my examination, regardless of what I think the end outcome will be, does not change.
Now, when examining Q62, were you able to find any latent fingerprints?
No, I was not.
In examining Q63, were you able to find any latent fingerprints?
No, I was not.
And in examining Q64, were you able to find any latent fingerprints?
No, I was not.
During your examination of these exhibits, did you note in your notes something that you did see?
Yes, I did.
We would renew our previous motions and objections.
Renewed objections will be overruled.
And on which exhibit did you see this item we're going to talk about?
Let me refer to my notes, please.
Please do.
It was on Q63.
And what did you see?
During my examination of Q63, an outline of a heart appeared in one of the corners on the edge of that piece of duct tape.
Now, what process were you using when you noticed this artifact?
I was using an alternate light source called RUVIS, which is an acronym that stands for Reflective Ultraviolet Imaging System. This process is utilized after superglue, and it helps visualize a three-dimensional object or an object that has different depths or dirt or not a flat surface. It also helps visualize reflective surfaces. It helps minimize the glare and any bumps or distortion that flat surface may have. This alternate light source helps make that a flat, non-reflective image.
Is that process used normally to raise otherwise invisible fingerprints?
It helps eliminate any background that the object that you're processing for the development of latent prints may have in interfering with properly visualizing latent prints.
Now, can you give us any further description of what this shape looked like? About how big was it?
It was approximately the size of a dime. And the best way to illustrate what I saw was if you were to wear a Band-Aid for an extended period of time and eventually remove that Band-Aid, you have that glue or debris surrounding the outer edges of that Band-Aid. The outline of the heart resembled that glue or debris that if you had been wearing a Band-Aid for an extended period of time. However, rather than in the shape of a Band-Aid, it was in the shape of a heart.
Now, upon seeing that, did you believe it to be of any special significance in the case at the time you saw it?
At the time, no.
Did you note it in your file?
I noted it in my file, and I notified the appropriate people involved in the case.
Did you also call over a supervisor to view it as well?
Yes, a supervisor was with me that evening and also observed the heart shape on the duct tape as well.
Sustained. Motion to strike the last answer will be granted.
Thank you. Without saying what she may have said, did she come over and view it in your presence?
Yes, she did.
All right. Now, did you photograph it?
No, I did not.
Why not?
My job is to process evidence and examine evidence for the detection of latent prints, to then take those latent prints and compare them to known prints, other latent prints, or to search them in the FBI's fingerprint database. When I observe something that is unexpected, I note it and continue on with my examination. The FBI does not require photographing of unexpected items to be done. In this case, when I observed the unexpected item, I continued on with my examination. And upon completion of processing and examining the duct tape, I did attempt to photograph the heart. However, at that point in time, it was no longer visible on the object.
Now, what had you done to the object between when you first saw it and when you... Let me stop. Did you later come back and photograph it based upon discussions with law enforcement that it might actually be something important?
No, I did.
Overall.
Go ahead.
No, I did not.
Why did you go back and attempt to photograph it later?
I had completed my examination and felt that at that point it was appropriate to attempt a photograph.
What processes had you used on the tape in order to try and lift prints between seeing it and then not being able to find it again?
I conducted an alternate dye stain known as RAM. Each of those letters stand for a different dye stain. RAM is a strong solvent that colors superglue so that when I can visualize white superglue prints on white objects or objects that have a reflective property to them underneath an alternate light source such as a laser. This allows... I'm sorry. Sure. RAM is a dye stain that dye stains white superglue prints. This dye stain enables a fingerprint examiner to look at white fingerprints on white objects and also on reflective objects by utilizing alternate light sources such as a laser. The print, rather than being white underneath the alternate light source, will then glow an orange type color. I used that examination as well as black powder, which is the typical black powder as you see on CSI with the brush. And I also used alternate black powder, which is that same black powder mixed with a solution to process anything that is sticky or glue-like on the items of evidence.
But when you went back to try and photograph the whatever it was, you couldn't find it anymore.
That is correct.
Now, do you know what that artifact was?
Other than stating that it was in the shape of a heart, approximately the size of a dime, I cannot go further.
And do you have any idea how it got there, when it got there, who put it there, or why?
No, I do not.
No further questions.
Cross-examination.
May it please the court. Good morning, Ms. Fontaine.
Good morning.
The items that you were given to inspect, you were given them second, correct? Q62 to Q64?
What do you mean by second?
Who was the first person from the FBI to receive these items?
All items of evidence are received in our evidence control unit as a standard policy and protocol within our unit, and they conduct an inventory. After the 3 pieces of duct tape went to our evidence control unit, it did, according to my chain of custody, prior to me going to the trace evidence unit. However, how the evidence went from the evidence control unit to the trace unit is not detailed in my case records.
Okay. I apologize. I'm not sure I understood that.
That's okay.
Okay. First, it's collected at the scene, right?
Correct.
And then Orange County Sheriff's Office has it, right?
I do not know the travel path of these 3 pieces of tape other than once they were received in the FBI laboratory.
Now, it goes to Tampa first, does it not?
Again, I don't know the path until it enters into the laboratory.
Okay. And then it got to the evidence control unit.
That's correct.
Okay. These are the people who kind of distribute which evidence goes to where, correct?
That is correct. They also conduct an inventory of evidence received.
They basically, they're the ones inventorying everything and saying, okay, this is going to go here first and this here second, and so on and so forth.
That is correct.
Okay. So evidence control unit got it, right?
Yes.
Then it was taken to your division, correct?
Prior to me receiving it, it was received in the trace evidence unit. That is where I received the 3 pieces of duct tape from.
And the trace evidence unit searches it for trace evidence, correct?
Upon their initial receipt of the items of evidence, they contacted myself so that I can conduct a visual examination on the items. This is typically done because latent prints are generally latent print unit generally receives evidence last. So we work closely with other units so that if there's any fingerprints that may be seen visually, we can photographically capture them then rather than waiting for it to be received in our unit at a later point in time.
Okay. So now we're at trace evidence unit.
Correct.
And they call you over while they are conducting their examination.
That's correct.
And they're searching for hair,
I assume so, yes.
fibers,
Again, I assume so.
anything that would assist a jury in determining what's going on with this piece of evidence, correct?
And again, yes, I assume so.
All right. Now, then it goes to you.
Yes.
Okay. And the very first thing you did you start with Q62?
I initially started, I don't exactly remember if I started with 1, 2, or 3. Since they were 2 stacked together and 1 was separate, I'm sure I started with the one that was separate first, which was Q62.
Okay. So you're the second division, so to speak, to get this, or the second person to get this type of evidence, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you got Q62, you then began, what was the first process you did for fingerprinting?
Initially, when I received the 3 pieces of duct tape after being notified by the trace evidence unit, I conducted a visual examination. This is very basic by holding the items of evidence and maybe rotating or tilting it slightly for different lighting to see if any latent prints are visible without any chemicals or forensic processes.
And this helps you in your normal course. This is something you're trained to do because this often allows you to pick up latent prints, correct?
It is always the first step in our examination process, yes.
Okay. What's the second step?
The second step is a laser, which is just like you see on TV or the laser pointers. It's very similar to that. It's at a wavelength that allows us to visualize or potentially visualize latent prints.
And the wavelength of the laser is what allows you to see any types of items that may or may not be on the tape, correct?
Yes, a certain percentage of the population has fingerprints that naturally fluoresce, given the lotions that they use on a daily basis or the items that they handle. So we look at second look at evidence using a laser to see if there's any naturally fluorescing fingerprints.
Okay, and then what's the third step you take?
The third step is UV or ultraviolet. It's very similar to the laser. It's just at a different frequency, again, to visualize any potentially naturally occurring fluorescing fingerprints.
And these different frequencies are what allows you to sometimes pick up on latents that the previous alternating light sources do not, correct?
That is correct. Our processes are in a sequence that allows us to optimize the visualization of latent prints.
And then what is step 4?
In this case, step 4, the items of evidence actually went back to the trace evidence unit for them to do a full collection of their evidence that they needed to do.
And then at that point, that's when they may take out any fibers or anything that's there.
That is correct.
Okay. Then it came back to you, did it not?
That is correct.
And what happened when you got it on that occasion?
When I got all 3 pieces of tape back the second time, I redid the first 3 steps that I just told you about: visual examination, laser examination, and ultraviolet light examination. This was done because Q63 and Q64 were once stacked on top of each other, and now they no longer were.
And that was disconnected by the trace evidence unit?
Yes.
Okay. A completely different person?
Correct.
Okay. So now we're at, I believe, step 6.
Sure. Step 6 is super glue. And I'm sure if you've seen CSI, you see them stick the tube in the car and the white fumes super glue the interior of the car. It's the same thing, just on a different scale, and all 3 pieces of tape were super glued.
Okay. And how does that assist you in being able to lift fingerprints?
Super glue is attracted to moisture. So when the evidence is superglued it is superglued in a humidity chamber, which means we add moisture to the air within that chamber. That moisture is attracted to any latent prints that may be on that item of evidence. That moisture then attracts the superglue to that moisture and eventually allows the superglue to harden, making almost like a coating or a shell over that latent print.
Okay. And then what did you do after that?
The next after superglue was
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop you. That's step 7, right?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
The next step after superglue is RUVIS, that reflective ultraviolet imaging system that I spoke of previously.
Now, the RUVIS system is fairly advanced, is it not?
I don't know what you mean by advanced.
Let me rephrase that. For the layperson, describe to us what RUVIS is.
Sure. The RUVIS system is an ultraviolet light that is shown down through a filter and a camera onto the object. This camera then presents an image onto a computer screen. It's very similar to the one next to me, and it allows you to visualize the object. So you're actually not looking at the object, but you're looking at the monitor while you visualize what the RUVIS is doing. And the RUVIS, as I spoke of earlier, shines down onto the object, helping eliminate any reflective properties that the item may have, and also helps take away the 3D effect that may be on that item as a result of debris or dirt or crinkles in the actual material.
And the filter is what allows for that to occur, correct?
I'm not sure how it works exactly. I know when all put together, that's how it works.
Okay. And that comes up on a screen. It's also blown up for you, somewhat. I don't want to use like a microscope, but basically enlarges it for you, does it not?
Yes, since the imaging system, the image is portrayed on a monitor very similar to this size, the object that is visualized through the imaging system is enlarged to fit onto the monitor screen.
Okay. And that is step 8.
I guess, yes.
Okay. Anything else after that?
After the RUVIS, the next step is the RAM, where's that alternate dye stain that I spoke about, and the final process is black powder.
Let me stop you there. Explain RAM for us.
Sure. RAM is a dye stain that is used on top of superglue. The superglue I use is the same superglue that you guys all have at your house. It dries white, clear type color. So sometimes it is hard to actually visualize that cloudy white type print that may be on an object. So we utilize a dye stain, and at the FBI, we mostly utilize RAM. This dye stain stains that superglue rather than a white color. It gives it fluorescent properties to it so that I can utilize the ultraviolet light and a laser to help visualize that latent print, and now it will glow orange.
And then after the RAM, that's after step 9, what happens on step 10?
In this case, step 10 for me was alternate black powder. This is regular black powder mixed with a solution, which is then painted onto any glue or sticky substance that may be on the item. Typically, step 9 or alternate black powder is utilized only when there is a glue type substance. It is not a normal procedure on items of this type.
And that was your final test, correct?
No, I have one more.
Oh, okay.
The final step was black powder. This is the traditional black powder that you've seen on where they dust and they powder with a brush on the counters. This is just black powder that is applied.
And why is that used? I'm sorry if you can throw that in there as
fine.
well.
Latent prints, because they are comprised of oil, sweat, or similar substances, when you touch an object, you leave behind a fragmentary reproduction of your friction ridge arrangement that leaves behind oil or sweat. So when you powder, and you all seen them when they do on CSI, they take the brush and they... I'm sorry. When you powder and you move the brush between your fingers over the latent print that is comprised of oil, sweat, or similar substances, that powder is attracted to and adheres to, in a sense, to the moisture of that latent print.
And 11 is where we conclude.
I've lost count, so I guess yes.
Okay. Now, after you've done this, you, of course, do this on both sides, correct?
The alternate black powder is only applied to the glue type area, so that was a specified area that was applied to.
But all the other steps were on both sides of the tape.
That is correct.
And that's because someone could touch both sides of the tape with either finger, correct?
Yes, I don't go into processing an item of evidence with any expectations. So all of our processes and all of our examinations is conducted on the entirety of the object.
Now that's how you went through Q62.
And Q63 and Q64.
About to go there. So Ms. Fontaine, then you went to Q63, and don't worry, I won't make you repeat all that stuff again.
Okay.
But you started on Q63. Now, I recall in your testimony, you were very specific that you didn't want to say any more than what you saw, right?
That is correct.
And you can't speculate any further than that, correct?
That is correct.
Now, Q63, when you saw this small item, it was just something visual, correct?
It was something that I visualized in the RUVIS system, or that reflective ultraviolet imaging system.
And that was step 7.
I don't remember.
Okay. And then after you had completed step 11, you came back and it was no longer there.
Upon completion of processing the item of evidence, it was no longer visible, yes.
Okay. So, however, when you saw that item, this was after you had gotten it, or after you had gotten it back from the trace evidence unit for the second time, correct?
All of my processes were done after the examination of the trace evidence unit.
Okay, so it goes, so you have something that is received at the FBI, it goes to trace evidence, you're there, you do a visual there, then it comes to you, correct?
Correct.
Then it goes back to trace evidence unit, correct?
Sustain.
And then you get it back, and that's where you started step 1 through 11, correct?
I restarted steps 1, 2, and 3, and then introduced 4 through the end.
Okay. And after you received something, you actually did a report in this case, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in the report, you indicate that Q62 through Q64 had no fingerprints whatsoever.
That is correct.
And this is including your thorough examination of each piece backwards and forwards, correct?
Yes.
And you follow, or you're aware of this item of evidence because it's an item of evidence that you may testify in this case, correct?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
What I mean is you're aware that the item of evidence, after you're finished with it, goes back to evidence control and then probably to another division.
That is correct.
And you're aware that the item was later contaminated by another member, weren't it?
Hearsay. May we approach?
You may. Objection sustained. You may continue.
Ms. Fontaine, after you conclude your examination, you just fill out a report of what you know and what you don't know, correct?
I fill out a report with what my conclusions are.
Okay. And your conclusions when inspecting Q62, Q63, and Q64 was after doing a complete and total workup using multiple different techniques, you were not able to find any fingerprints on either piece of duct tape.
That is correct.
I have no further questions.
Redirect.
You said that Q63 and Q64 were stacked.
That is correct.
Which was on top?
According to my...
Overruled.
Q63 was on top of Q64.
No further questions.
May the witness be excused.
Subject to recall.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
As we'd indicated earlier, our only other witnesses we have The next witnesses available will not be here till tomorrow morning, so we have no further witnesses to present this afternoon or tomorrow morning. We apologize for the inconvenience, but the schedules couldn't be adjusted.
The witnesses for tomorrow will be here tomorrow when?
They will, I believe they arrive at 11, so they should be here and ready to testify at 1:30 in the court's normal afternoon schedule.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me give you an update as far as I know what's going on, and that is subject to change. Based upon what I know and what the lawyers think may happen, is that the state may wrap up their presentation tomorrow afternoon or sometime Wednesday. Just depends. But they should conclude their presentation tomorrow or sometime by noon on Wednesday. We had anticipated the defense starting on Thursday, but they are trying to accelerate that process to start on Wednesday, if possible. But we will know, because you got to shift some travel plans and run through those logistics with other witnesses. So far, we are ahead of schedule. Depending on the length of the defense's presentation, and we will have some flavor of that by Saturday, we should have an idea that maybe the following week, and I use the word maybe, and we will recalculate that after we look at it. Probably I don't want to make a guesstimate on that until Saturday, but I kind of think that maybe by the end of next week we will conclude all of the evidence in this case, and get you deliberating hopefully the 25th or the 27th. But that is all subject to change, so don't hold me exactly to that. That is my best. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to recess for the balance of the day. That may put a crimp in our plans as far as your lunch, but they will go through with your lunch plans. I don't know what your lunch plans were today. And we will see you tomorrow afternoon. Can't we get started at 1 o'clock, Mr. Ashton, rather than 1:30?
We'll do our best to do that. If they arrive on schedule, then we should be able to do that. If not, I'll
Okay,
let you know.
keep us apprised of any change in plans, but we will restart tomorrow at 1 p.m. Any additional instructions on behalf of the state or the defense,
Not for the state.
other than the renewed request for the instruction that you've given, asked me to give, that I've denied?
From the defense.
Okay, we'll be in recess to 1 p.m. tomorrow.